Toki ya, miyan kikan-san, miwile pana e sona pi Toki Pona. Hey, my name's Greg Dan3. I want to teach you about Toki Pona. Today, we're going to be talking about the very first few words in Toki Pona and the most important kind of sentence that you're going to see. It's going to crop up throughout your entire time speaking the language, so learn this well. To start with, we're going to look at just the words that you're going to see during this lesson, and most importantly, the words me and sina. So let's have a look at how those are drawn, talk about how to remember how they're drawn, and of course, what they mean. So first, we have this symbol, which is me, M-I, and it's a first-person pronoun, as in anything from I, me, myself, to we, our, ourselves. Toki Pona doesn't care about plurality. It just cares about this symbol, or the word me, referring to the speaker and any group that includes the speaker. First-person pronouns. Then we have sina, and that is drawn like so. To spell that out for you, S-I-N-A. And that is Toki Pona's second-person pronoun. Just like me, it doesn't involve any kind of specification of plurality. It can be you, yours, yourself, and y'all, y'alls, y'allselves, all at the same time, or in context, any one in particular, right? And to remember how these are drawn, you can imagine me as being like pointing your thumb toward yourself. Something like that. And then with sina, you can imagine it to be something like pointing your index finger out towards somebody else. Like that. Now, that isn't necessarily the way everybody remembers these symbols, and not all of them even have a clear, obvious mnemonic for how to be remembered, but nonetheless, you can at least recall that me is drawn pointing downward toward the speaker, and sina is drawn pointing upward toward the listener. Or if you would think of it being top down, me then points toward yourself, and sina points away from yourself. So those are the first two words we're going to talk about, and the next are going to be Toki and Pona. So Toki is drawn with a circle and 3 lines overhead, and it is spelled like this. T-O-K-I. For reference, the 3 lines are called emitters. Now, while this isn't the most obvious thing in the world, I would say I can't think of an honest mnemonic for it, but it's a cute symbol and I think it's pretty memorable. And it's especially memorable because it is the name of the language. Now, before I describe what Toki means exactly, let's also talk about Pona. Pona is drawn with a simple smile. P-O-N-A. And that one's pretty easy to remember. So let's talk now about what these mean. Toki refers to speaking, conversation, just as well as it refers to language. And mind you, it can refer to any kind of speaking, language, conversation. You could, for example, think of thinking itself, the idea of having a thought in your mind as a kind of toki in some cases. Especially where that toki, that thought, is something that involves words. Toki, and as we'll learn, all of the words in Toki Pona encompass a very wide area, a very large number of concepts in English. And you might think of them as being a singular, very broad concept in Toki Pona. So then, moving on, we have the word Pona, which means simple or good. Now, this one's very cute, mostly because it's used for all sorts of simple acknowledgments in the language, but it has a broad range of capability, just like Toki. If you were to say something like, me Pona, that would be, I am good. That statement has many other interpretations as well, such as, I am well, I am good, I am healthy, I am satisfied. Pona isn't limited to just the idea of good. It can express many other things. And together, these glyphs are normally written combined as Toki Pona, the language of good. And if you're familiar with Toki Pona's book, it is normally named this way, referred to this way in English. Toki Pona, the language of good, is the name of Toki Pona's first book, Pu, as it's known in the language. We'll get to that later, but for now, understand that we have Toki, which means to speak, say, and also to refer to language, and it can refer to thoughts as well. And then we have Pona, which means something that is good or simple, at least in a good way. And then together, these two symbols can be how you represent Toki Pona when you're writing in the language. Toki Pona being the actual language. So let's move on. We've got a few more words here. Now in Toki Pona, there are no true opposites. However, we do have the word ike, which you might notice is Pona flipped right upside down. And yes, ike is drawn with a frown. And it does represent some concepts that are like opposites to Pona. For example, it says something is bad, difficult, complex, unwieldy, unfriendly, right? Ike, again, encompasses a large number of ideas, but it is not an opposite to Pona. There are things which are Ike that are not the opposite of things which are Pona. And we'll get more into what that means as these lessons progress. But you might think of Ike and Pona as being counterparts on opposite sides of a spectrum, referring to different concepts in that range, objects closer to themselves on that spectrum. And then we have the word yan, spelled J-A-N. And yan means person, but it means person in any sense. It could be an individual person you're referring to on the street, just as well as it could be referring to literally anybody whatsoever in the collective sense. It could also be somebody who you don't personally know, literally some person, somebody, and literally anybody. The idea those words encompass are part of what yan can refer to. And as you can see, it's basically drawn like a little abstract person. We have the head, and we have the shoulders. Moving on, we then have moku. This symbol may look a little odd because unlike the others, it looks like two independent shapes. We'll get to why that is later, but suffice to say, some of Toki Pona's writing system uses two individual glyphs to refer to a single thing. But these two individual glyphs work together to express a single concept. Here, that single concept is moku. And the two glyphs in question are hand and mouth. Moku is the word for to eat or to drink, more generally to consume. Then we have musi, M-U-S-I. And musi refers to all kinds of entertainment, fun, enjoyment. Musi is, again, a very broad concept, and it can also refer to both something being amusing and somebody being amused. You could say, this person is funny, or this person is laughing, and both of those would be, this person is doing something musi, right? We'll get to how to express that in the language later on. But suffice to say, musi, again, is very broad and can be both descriptive and actionable. Continuing, here we have another specific pair of words. That is suli, S-U-L-I, and lili, L-I-L-I. Suli refers to things being large and important. It can be literally wide, tall, all-encompassing, and it can be something that is critical, required, absolutely important. Lili is, again, not the opposite, but it expresses some concepts on the opposite side. Suli is, so to speak, its counterpart. Lili refers to things which are small, things which are few in number, and things that are young. You could refer to a child as lili, just as well as you could refer to a young plant as lili, or a small number of fruits as Lili, and we'll get to how that works later on. As for writing these two, they're essentially this curvish V shape. One is particularly large, the other is small. And then we have two more words. Here we have lape, L-A-P-E, and we have mama, M-A-M-A. So lape refers to the action or the state of resting, napping, relaxing, and mama refers to parents, ancestors, guardians, anybody who is in your family tree who came before you. And to remember how these are drawn, lape is drawn as somebody laying on their back. You have their body laying out to the side and their head, presumably resting on a pillow. And then for mama, you have this circular shape and a smaller circle attached to the bottom. Now, something to note about mama, and something that you may have noticed from the earlier presentations of me and Sina, is that Toki Pona doesn't mark gender either. Where other languages do mark gender in their pronouns and in many of their words, Toki Pona doesn't do so. Mama, though it does look like the female gender word for mother, for parent, excuse me, it actually can refer to male and female parents and parents of any gender in particular. More exactly, it doesn't care about gender. Mama can be a mother just as well as a father, just as well as a parent who doesn't specify their gender. All right, and that's all of the words we're going to be going over for this lesson. For the remainder of the lesson, I'm going to be giving examples of sentences which we're going to be translating after a given context into English. So let me clear the board, and let's start with our first example sentence, which is going to be me, Toki. Now, when you're reading this, it goes from left to right. There are other writing systems that write in a different order, such as from right to left or top down, but we're going to be writing from left to right, as in standard English. So this first sentence, me Toki, let's think of some context for it. In the case of me Toki, let's imagine that we are standing, waiting in line to go give a presentation at a big conference. We're in our fancy suit, and we're listening to somebody else speak, we hear the audience clap, and then it's our turn. We walk up to an attendant right on the side of the stage, and we say, me Toki. Which, if we think about it literally, about the definitions given earlier, would be as simple as I speak. And that would be a totally correct interpretation. But with the context given of this big presentation we're about to give, and the fact that we turn to an attendant and say, me Toki, and then walk on the stage, you would interpret it more precisely, something like, I'm speaking next, or I'm about to present. Super precise words for these concepts don't really exist in Toki Pona. However, you can still express them, particularly in context, in a way that would make more sense to translate them in those precise ways when coming back into another natural language. So let's try another example. Let's try mi moku. So let's think of some context for this one. Mi moku, for example, you could be sitting down at a table in a nice restaurant when you suddenly receive a phone call. It's your friend asking what's going on, what are you doing? Maybe you've been missing for a little while and you just disappeared because you want to have a night for yourself. And you say to him simply, mi moku. Well, obviously in context, this would be something like, I'm eating dinner. The literal interpretation of mi moku is just, I eat, or I am eating, right? But I'm eating dinner is what's expressed by the context of the situation. Now, generally, statements don't exist without their context, right? Language exists in context, exists in situations. So let's try another one. Let's try mi Pona. Now, Thinking about this literally before we get on to the context, me Pona will be something like I am good, I am well, and we discussed it earlier in this lesson. But, very important to note, it can express a lot more than just I am good or well. Let's say, for example, you get home from a doctor's office and your partner asks you what the doctor said. And you say to them, me Pona. That will be something like, I am well. I am perfectly healthy. In fact, let's turn this around and see what would have happened at the doctor's office. So let's now look at the sentence, sina Pona. Now, turning this around, let's say you've walked into the doctor's office, you've gone through your whole routine visit, you get a clean bill of health, and the doctor says to you, sina Pona. You're healthy, perfectly clean, no problems here. Again, context is critical, right? Because in Toki Pona, there are a million other ways that you might say you are healthy. And we'll get to what those are later on as we learn more words. But simply saying sina Pona, more than enough to express the idea in the right context. All right, now let's try a funny example. Let's say that the sentence is me yan. Now, of course, there are plenty of situations where you might say, in the literal sense, I am a person, I am a human, but if your experience is anything like mine, probably that hasn't come up too much in either your native language or any others you might speak. Having to specify to somebody that you're human doesn't usually come up, because a lot of times when you're speaking, there is a default assumption that you are speaking to a human. That being said, what if you were on voice chat? On voice chat, you can't see the other person speaking. And so nobody on voice chat would know that you're actually a bear. And if you're a bear, you need to cover your tracks. You tell the rest of the voice chat, me yan. I am definitely human. I am a person. I swear. This is a goofy version of how this statement might be used, but it does get at an interesting truth about Toki Pona, which is the fact that it's perfectly capable of expressing things about situations that aren't really realistic, that are fictional, absurd even. Toki Pona isn't limited to things that are just reasonable, possible. It can talk about the truly impossible as well. And this is a pretty small taste of what that looks like, but certainly it works. Let's try another example. Let's try me Lily. Me Lily is pretty simple. Interpreted literally, it would be something like, I am small, I am short, I am young, or maybe worded more gently, I'm not very tall. But let's imagine a fun context for it. Let's say there's a little kid trying his absolute best to jump up to the counter to get at a box of cookies sitting there waiting for him that mom said he couldn't have. He reaches his absolute best, but he's not quite tall enough. So he sits down on the ground, huffs and says, me Lily. I'm too short. I'm too small. I can't do it. Again, another funny example of how it might work. But, continuing, let's now try me mama. So, me mama works like this. It will be expressing, I am a parent, I am a guardian. Maybe if you stretch it a little bit, I am a babysitter. I am in charge of somebody in some guiding capacity, right? Mama, like any of the other Toki Pona words, is very, very broad. Doesn't only limit itself to one concept. Now let's think of a context for this statement, me mama. Let's say we have a couple who have come home to one of the two's parents, and they have exciting news for their parents. They want to say, hey, our family is growing bigger. And they say to their parents, me mama, we're parents now. Now that's an exciting example right there. You can see that me doesn't just refer to a single person in this case. Me is now plural. We. And then mama, parents. And of course we have a little bit of grammar glue that comes in with English. We are parents. Exclamation point. Now we're going to move on to words involving sina. Now we did one example of this before. All the remainders are going to be involving sina. So our very first one is going to be sina musi. Sina musi. That's something like you're fun, you're entertaining, you're a jokester, you're a comedian, right? Well, a context for this that you might imagine would be, let's say your friend tells a joke, and it's pretty funny, but it's not funny enough that you laughed out loud. So instead, you just tell them straight up, you're funny. And in English, that sounds a little sarcastic, but I think this would work. Sina musi. You, funny. Again, we have our grammar glue right here in the middle. You are funny. Sina musi. Moving on. How about sina moku? Let's say you walk past your roommate's door. It's barely cracked open, and you step in, just want to check on him, see what's going on. You look at him, and you see he's eating your snacks. And you're so surprised by this, you just state it as a fact. Sina moku. You're eating food. You're eating my food. Sina moku will totally get across the fact that you are not pleased at the goings-on. You're eating? Question mark, exclamation point. Let's move on to another one. Let's say you enter a convenience store. You're walking through and you start hearing a commotion coming from the front counter. You can hear somebody being really loud, really demanding, just altogether very, very unkind. And you want to stand up to this person and say, sina ike. You find your courage, you walk up to them and you say it. Sina ike. You're being rude. You are rude. Now, as noted before, ike refers to bad, difficult, complex. But just as with pona referring to somebody being healthy, ike can refer to somebody being rude. They both have very broad contexts that, again, are not opposites, but are in a collection on a spectrum. Let's move on to another example. So this one's going to be interesting. And it'll be interesting because it'll play on two different meanings of one word at the same time. Sina suli. That might be like, you were tall, you were large, you were big, you were important. Let's think of a context for it. Let's say there's a tall woman standing at a bus station waiting for the bus to come, and next to her are a mother and a child. And the child is standing there in absolute awe at this businesswoman in her fancy suit with her big suitcase, wondering, wow, is she an astronaut? As kids do. And then the kid finally walks up to her, pulls on her sleeve and says, Sina suli, you're so big. And yeah, she is absolutely towering over this child. So yeah, this could totally mean, you're so tall. You're so tall. But remember that our businesswoman in the story is in a suit with her fancy suitcase. She's probably pretty important too. And that's just as well a meaning of sina suli as you're tall. You're tall. You're important. And yeah, you could totally expect a little kid to just walk up to anybody and start throwing out whatever statements they like. Kids are unstoppable in that wonderful way. But the important thing here is that sina suli doesn't refer to either of these ideas individually, either tall or important. Instead, it refers to them as a collection. So let's pause for a moment and think about fruit. Specifically, the English word F-R-U-I-T, fruit. So in Toki Pona, most words are vague. They refer to a large collection of concepts as though they were one single thing. And in Toki Pona, they actually are. The word fruit in English is a pretty good example of a similar idea. If you were holding a bunch of bananas and a couple apples, in either of your hands and you said, I'm holding fruit. Well, yes, you are. There's nothing wrong with that statement. It's not ambiguous, it's just vague. So you're holding your bananas and your apples, and you say to yourself, I'm holding fruit. Well, you don't need to specify any further, right? And yeah, in Toki Pona, it works just the same way as the English word fruit. In fact, there is a word for both fruits and vegetables in Toki Pona, which works exactly like that. If you ever need to distinguish them, in English you can use their names, but you could also describe them. And in Toki Pona, you pretty much always describe them. But Toki Pona also asks you to back up and ask the question, do I need to specify? Is it important to do so? Or can context do most of the work? And yes, absolutely. Generally, your listeners will understand what's going on. All right, so we have one more example here of a Toki Pona to English exercise. I'll do a handful of English to Toki Pona exercises, and then I'm going to do the conclusion. First, Toki Pona to English. We're just going to do the word Toki. Toki, on its own, is a way to say hello. How are you doing? And you might have heard me say that at the very start of this lesson. Toki, on its own, could be interpreted literally something like conversation is starting. And figuratively, it's like any kind of greeting. It could be, hello, how are you? Yo, good morning. Hey, what's up? Anything like that. As a context for this, let's imagine there's a group of bored students sitting in their seats, poking at their phones, doodling in their textbooks, kind of not interested in the goings-on, and then their teacher walks in, sits down at her desk, and says, Toki. She's saying hello to her class. So let's do a couple of English to Toki Pona exercises. So English to Toki Pona is interesting. It's harder to provide a context for these because generally, I wouldn't say you lose information necessarily. You can preserve all of it, but you tend to simplify the concepts that are going on in a language, in a statement from a natural language when going to Toki Pona. So let's take, for example, I'm having a conversation. So the statement, I'm having a conversation, it does involve at least one more word than we're going to need. In fact, it involves kind of 3 more words than we're going to need in the final Toki Pona statement. But as an idea, I'm having a conversation. I am talking, presumably with some other person. I'm having a conversation. So for starters, we know that the speaker is describing their experiences. So that's me. Definitely how this sentence begins. And then having a conversation. So if you've gotten ahead of me and looked at a dictionary, you might have noticed that there is a word in Toki Pona for to have, to hold, or possess. But just be aware, it doesn't work the same way in Toki Pona as the apparent counterpart in English. To have something in English can be to have, say, an event, some time. Like, hey, have a good summer, right? Or have a nice vacation. But in Toki Pona, you can't really have those things. However, you can have a conversation in English and speak in Toki Pona, or Toki, as it were. Me, Toki. So we don't have a conversation, but we do speak. Me, Toki. Let's do one more example. Let's say you're young. Now, this one maps pretty literally to the original Toki Pona. You is our second person pronoun, so we can just pop that right in. There is sina. And then young, well, we talked about the fact that lili can refer to both small things and young things. So that's the next one. Lili. Sina lili. Now, if you'd like some more exercises, on my website, there's a couple of links to various lessons done by others, as well as exercises in parallel to this lesson. If you'd like to try those, please go ahead. Otherwise, you can immerse on the Discord in Ma Pona Pe Toki Pona, or join more of the live meetups in VR chat. I've got one more section of this lesson, and then we're good to go. So, this is going to be primarily a glue section, as it were, providing a lot of extra details to what's going on behind the scenes in these different statements. So as you might have noticed, the very first element of the sentence is the subject. So let's write that out. Let's say we had the sentence, Sina, Toki, as we had before. Sina is our subject, and Toki is our predicate. Now, we don't have to worry about all the little details of how this works, where these words come from. If you're not familiar with grammar, that's all right. There's not going to be too much needed for learning Toki Pona. But I do recommend you become familiar with at least the idea of there being a distinct subject and a distinct predicate in a sentence. In Toki Pona, the predicate can be both an action and a description. You might say they are verbs or adjectives. We'll get into a couple of those categories and how that distinction works later on, but suffice to say, the predicate can be descriptive and an action. Therefore, you can't, out of context, tell apart you are speaking from you are a language. One of them being an action and the other being a description. Now, we'll get to more examples of Toki Pona sentences in the future, but I do have one more example for right now. Sina Pona. You're excellent. Thank you so much for listening.